Hello, beloved listeners. Thank you for joining me today. This is a story about the devastating truth that sometimes the wounds in our hearts are inflicted not by strangers, but by the very people we raised, the people we love the most. It is a story about betrayal and the quiet strength of a woman who chose to reclaim her life and her name. It's a powerful lesson that your age does not define your worth. 5 years. That's how long it had been since I lost my Arthur. Losing him left a void in my life that no amount of time could fill. He was my safe harbor, a kind man, a successful business owner, and her best friend. Now, my house felt like a museum of a life once lived, and that loss, that vulnerability, seemed to be all my son, Michael, and his wife, Sarah, could see. They didn't see Eleanor, a mother who was grieving. They only saw a wallet that was inexplicably slow to open. If you are a parent, you know that deep pain, that unsettling fear that your child sees you not as a person, but as a resource. It is the silent burden carried by so many in our generation. During the funeral, Michael and Sarah were picture perfect. They held her hand, offered tissues, and delivered tearful eulogies about their wonderful father. But beneath the veneer of grief, the atmosphere was thick with a calculated impatience. They were waiting. They were waiting for the reading of the will. If you've ever had to face the reading of a loved one's last wishes, you know that moment. It should be solemn, a final act of respect. But for Eleanor, sitting in the lawyer's sterile office, it felt like an audition. Michael, the eldest, a man whose ambition outweighed his heart, fidgeted impatiently. Sarah, always the demanding one, wore a tight, expectant smile. The lawyer, a tall, somber man named Mr. Thompson, began with the usual legal formalities. Then he got to the crux of the matter. Arthur's assets, the beautiful family home, the one where Eleanor and Arthur raised their children, the one filled with 40 years of memories. Arthur had left it entirely to Eleanor, stating clearly, "To my dearest wife, Eleanor, for her comfort and peace for the rest of her days." The bulk of Arthur's substantial financial estate, the business and the investments, were to be split equally between Michael and Sarah. It was fair, but then came the twist, the cruel, calculated sentence that changed everything. Michael and Sarah were given their shares on one crucial condition, that they would ensure the financial and physical well-being of their mother, Eleanor, for the remainder of her life, with annual reviews overseen by Mr. Thompson. It was a clause of protection, ensuring Eleanor would never be a burden to anyone, but also, crucially, ensuring she would never be left destitute. Michael and Sarah exchanged a glance that was not one of gratitude, but of pure, cold fury. That clause, Arthur's final attempt to protect his wife, was seen by his children not as an act of love, but as a chain. They wanted the money, and they wanted the freedom to ignore their mother. They wanted the prize without the responsibility. The tension in the room was so thick, Eleanor could practically taste the bitterness. The moment the lawyer excused himself, the mask of grief fell completely. "You're a liability, Mom," Michael hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You're all that stands between us and control of Dad's money." It was a clarity so brutal it stole her breath. She had spent a lifetime nurturing and loving these two people, only to be branded a liability the moment her protector was gone. Sarah quickly joined the attack, her voice tight with indignation. "Do you know how much money that guardianship clause costs us, Mom? Annual reviews, legal fees, it's ridiculous. It's not fair to Dad's memory to waste his hard-earned money like that. I just lost your father," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "How can you be thinking only of money?" "Because Dad didn't think this through," Michael spat out. "He left you the house, fine. But that clause ties up a massive amount of the estate in legal requirements meant to look after you. We need that capital to grow the business." Then came the unspeakable command, delivered with a chilling finality. "We talked to the lawyer," Sarah said, folding her arms. "The easiest way to dissolve the guardianship clause is if you are no longer able to manage your own affairs. It's what's best for everyone." Eleanor felt a deep, sickening dread. What are you talking about? Michael leaned in, his eyes hard and empty. You're moving into the Willow Creek retirement home, Mom. Tonight. The house is going on the market tomorrow. That money needs to be liquidated immediately. The brutality of the announcement left Eleanor paralyzed. Tonight. They hadn't asked. They hadn't discussed. They hadn't even waited for her husband's grave to settle. They were kicking her out of her own home, the sanctuary where she had planned to grieve and live out her final years. No, Eleanor finally whispered, shaking her head. I won't. This is my home. Arthur left it to me. Technically, yes, Michael conceded with a cruel smile. But with the house liquidated and you safely under professional care, the court will see that we have fulfilled our obligation to secure your physical well-being and comfort, as per the will. The financial guardianship clause becomes unnecessary. It's a clean break, Mom. You get professional help and we get the freedom to manage the estate. That same evening, 2 large, strange men arrived with a retirement home van. Eleanor, still numb with shock, could barely put up a fight. They allowed her only 1 small suitcase. She watched Michael and Sarah supervise the moving team, treating her possessions, her whole life, as mere inventory. They didn't even look at her as she was escorted out of the front door of her own house for the last time. The first few days at Willow Creek were a waking nightmare. The smell of disinfectant and institutional cooking was a cruel parody of her life with Arthur. She felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of loneliness, intensified by the searing pain of her children's treachery. Worse than the physical displacement was the immediate emotional warfare. Michael and Sarah, desperate to justify their actions and preemptively counter any legal challenge, immediately began to paint a picture of Eleanor in social circles and local gossip blogs. The narrative was simple and vicious. Grieving widow suffers delusional break, needs professional care. They spoke of her failing memory, her increasingly erratic behavior, and her inability to manage her own affairs since Arthur's death. They hinted at my failing health and suggested that my claims were the result of early-onset dementia. They were strategically building a case to swiftly dissolve Arthur's protective guardianship clause. Eleanor was utterly isolated. I felt as if I were inside a glass bell, where I could see and hear the world, but no one could see or hear the truth of my pain. Every visit from a well-meaning nurse felt like an interrogation. She was trapped in the very fate her husband tried to prevent, becoming a voiceless victim, a financial burden, and ultimately, a piece of inventory in the hands of her greedy children. But in that crushing loneliness, something unexpected ignited. Michael and Sarah came to visit once, briefly, just to get her signature on some final paperwork concerning the sale of the house. They maintained the facade of being loving, dutiful children, explaining how lucky she was to receive such professional care. They talked only about their financial plans, the massive potential of their inheritance, and how they were finally free to manage the estate. They were so transparently focused on their financial freedom that they completely neglected the emotional and legal fine print. And then came their second fatal error. They handed her a small, inexpensive tablet during their visit. "It's just for video calls, Mom. Don't worry about the internet bills," Michael said dismissively. They assumed the tablet was merely a token, something a technologically inept old woman would use only to look at pictures of her grandchildren. But they didn't know that Eleanor, during the 40 years of Arthur's success, had quietly managed the finances of the family business, the logistics, and even taught herself a complex form of data entry to manage the business's inventory systems. She was the quiet architect behind Arthur's success, something they never acknowledged. They gave her a small tablet, and she saw it as a secret window into their world. They forgot who I was. That was their fatal error. The deep shame of the situation was replaced by a cold, surgical focus. Eleanor began to dry her tears. She had access to the internet, and more importantly, she had access to her old email accounts and the digital ledgers she and Arthur maintained. She began to dedicate her days at Willow Creek not to bingo or group therapy, but to meticulous research. She was the digital archivist now, quietly preparing her case. Her research revealed the extent of her children's financial recklessness. Michael immediately traded in his modest sedan for a high-end sports car. Sarah had quit her job, claiming she needed time to grieve, but was really just indulging in expensive shopping sprees. The estate money was being treated like found treasure, not a legacy to protect. They were bleeding the business dry, certain that the rest of the funds would soon be liberated from their mother's care. Eleanor knew she couldn't beat them with brute force. She needed a plan, intricate and devastating, that would strike them where it hurt most: their pride, their sense of entitlement, and their bank accounts. She needed to become the quiet, unseen force of justice. Her revenge would not be loud. It would be meticulously planned and entirely legal. Her focus narrowed to the single piece of legal protection Michael and Sarah had overlooked: the marital assets clause. Arthur, being the meticulous planner he was, had ensured that Eleanor, who helped build the business from the ground up, retained a crucial veto power over any major sale of the former family business for the first 5 years after his death. This was a secret only Eleanor and Mr. Thompson knew, and Arthur had hidden the details of the clause in an obscure, non-digitized annex of the will that Michael and Sarah were too impatient to fully review. She used the cheap tablet to access a secure, encrypted digital ledger she and Arthur maintained, a testament to their decades-long partnership. This ledger was the smoking gun, detailing her exact contributions and granting her signatory authority over any large-scale business transaction. Michael and Sarah thought they had dismissed the useless old woman, but they had armed the expert. Eleanor then initiated contact with Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer, the one man who still carried a sense of duty toward Arthur's wishes. She needed to prepare the legal documentation for her inevitable counterattack, a document so precise, so legally sound, that Michael and Sarah would have no grounds for appeal. She worked on this document for days, using her archival skills to cross-reference every legal citation and financial detail. Eleanor's quiet work began to pay dividends. She dedicated her days at Willow Creek not to bingo or group therapy, but to meticulously tracking Michael's ambitious moves in the family business. She learned to navigate the little tablet with ease, a defiant act against her children's assumptions of her incompetence. Michael, believing himself untouchable and having liquidated the family home, immediately set his sights on expanding the business by acquiring a rival company. This was the exact type of major sale that Arthur's marital assets clause was designed to prevent without Eleanor's written consent. The acquisition was Michael's crowning glory, meant to prove he was a better businessman than his father. It required a massive capital investment and was set to close in 3 weeks. He assumed his mother, safely tucked away in the retirement home, would be a non-issue. He planned to forge her signature if necessary, believing she was too out of the loop to notice. Eleanor was tracking his calls, his emails, and the public filings. She waited until the very last hour of the final business day before the acquisition was set to close. She contacted Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer, the one man who still carried a sense of duty toward Arthur's wishes. Mr. Thompson was stunned to hear from her. "Mrs. Jones, we heard—" "I know what you heard, Mr. Thompson," Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly. "But my mind is perfectly clear, and I have a document I need you to file immediately." She sent him a digitally notarized document, something she had quietly arranged online, another act they thought impossible for her, exercising her veto power over Michael's major acquisition. The document cited the marital assets clause and highlighted the reckless financial mismanagement of the estate by her children immediately following Arthur's death. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The acquisition deal collapsed just hours before closing. Michael had leveraged everything, including borrowed capital, on this deal. The sudden veto caused a massive financial panic. The bank froze the business's accounts, demanding collateral that Michael no longer had. The entire financial framework Michael had so arrogantly built crumbled into dust. The financial freeze wasn't just a business problem. It was a personal humiliation. Michael and Sarah, who had been loudly celebrating their impending success just days earlier, were now facing ruin. Their arrogance, their sense of entitlement, and their overestimation of their own financial genius were crashing down. Michael, believing his mother was either demented or secretly advised by an enemy, burst into the Willow Creek retirement home the next day. He found Eleanor seated calmly in the sun-drenched common lounge, reading a novel, the very picture of placid, harmless retirement. Sarah was a furious shadow behind him. "What did you do, Mom? You ruined me!" Michael's voice was a low snarl, attracting the attention of several residents. "That veto. It was an act of delusion. I'll have you declared legally unfit." Eleanor slowly set her book down, looking at him with the cool, appraising gaze of a CEO. "You're right, Michael. It was an act of management, not delusion." She spoke not as the frail old woman, but as the quiet architect of his father's empire. "When you removed me from my home, you declared that my physical well-being was your priority, but you failed to secure the financial well-being of the business you inherited. You were so focused on kicking me out of my home that you forgot I helped build the business you were so eager to destroy." Sarah screamed. "That clause was supposed to protect you. You've ruined the family name and the business." "No, Sarah," Eleanor replied, her voice firm. "Arthur wrote that clause to protect his business from your greed. It was a lockbox and you tried to break it with a sledgehammer. I simply enforced the lock." This was the emotional climax, the final devastating cue twist that showed them they had been outsmarted by the very person they tried to discard. The confrontation ended with Michael swearing vengeance and Sarah crying uncontrollably, escorted out by a confused but protective security guard. The other residents, who had only seen Eleanor as the quiet newcomer, now looked at her with a newfound respect. She had fought back and won. The days that followed were filled with legal maneuvers, but the outcome was inevitable. Michael's desperate attempt to have Eleanor declared mentally unfit backfired spectacularly. Mr. Thompson presented Eleanor's precise, hand-drafted legal filings, her organized digital ledger, and the clear financial evidence of Michael's mismanagement. The court ruled in Eleanor's favor, upholding the veto and confirming her financial competency. The business, now bankrupt due to Michael's failed acquisition and frozen accounts, had to be sold for parts to cover the debts. Michael and Sarah, stripped of their inheritance and facing massive personal financial liabilities, were left with nothing. Their entire future, which they had planned to build on greed and the betrayal of their mother, collapsed entirely. But Eleanor's revenge was deeper than money. It was about reclaiming her dignity. She used the quiet financial settlement from the liquidation of the business, a small sum that had remained untouchable due to her marital assets clause, to do two things. First, she paid off the Willow Creek retirement home for the trouble caused by her overly ambitious children and donated a significant sum anonymously to the home's library fund, a quiet act of grace. Second, she arranged entirely through Mr. Thompson to buy back her beautiful family home. It was a foreclosure sale, purchased back at a discount thanks to Michael's financial disaster. The day she walked back into her home, the air still faintly smelling of her husband's old tobacco and the scent of the rose bushes she had planted, she was no longer a victim. She was a victor, a woman who had fought back and won her life back. Eleanor invited Mr. Thompson for tea on the porch. "Michael and Sarah have nothing left, Mr. Thompson," she observed calmly. "They will eventually understand, Mrs. Jones," Mr. Thompson replied. "You did what your husband intended. You protected the family legacy from their greed, and you protected yourself." Eleanor smiled. "My action was not punishment, Mr. Thompson. It was an investment in their education." They had learned the devastating price of entitlement. They had learned the hard way that an inheritance is a privilege, not a guarantee, and that the quiet support behind a successful man often holds the true power. Eleanor never cut ties with her children completely. She let them face the consequences of their financial ruin, knowing that only rock bottom could teach them the value of the independence they had so carelessly thrown away. But she had also sent a clear message, one that resonates deeply with every elderly listener. Do not let your age or your grief define your worth. You are not a liability. You are a legacy. You have the power to protect your life, your home, and your dignity. Eleanor finally had the peace to mourn her husband, Arthur, in her own home, on her own terms. The silence was no longer cold and empty. It was the quiet, satisfying silence of a life reclaimed. She spent her days tending the rose bushes, reading books, and using her little tablet to keep track of her growing legacy. She was Ava Jones, the quiet architect of justice, finally living her life on her own terms. It was a rebirth, and it proved one simple, beautiful truth. It is never too late to reclaim your power.